Tonight, this is no longer just a breaking news story about a sudden operation in Venezuela, because what unfolded today has already detonated far beyond the borders of one country and is now sending shockwaves through diplomacy, domestic politics, military doctrine, and the fragile assumptions that hold the global order together. And the reason this moment matters so much is not only what allegedly happened on the ground, but the way power chose to describe it afterward. Because when President Trump emerged following reports of U.S. strikes and the reported capture of Nicolas Maduro, the tone was not one of closure or restraint, but of expansion, of ownership, of a declaration that suggested not an intervention concluded, but a new chapter beginning. And the language attributed to him and echoed through sympathetic media was not cautious or provisional, but sweeping and confident, invoking the idea that the United States would oversee Venezuela until a safe transition, speaking openly about oil infrastructure, American energy interests, boots on the ground, and even widening the rhetorical aperture to include Colombia and Cuba. And in geopolitics, that shift in language is not cosmetic, it is catalytic, because the moment a military action is framed not as a narrow objective, but as a governing mandate, the conflict transforms from a tactical strike into a strategic earthquake. And this is the first analytical truth viewers must understand if they want to see past the noise, because bombs change facts on the ground, but narratives change the lifespan of wars. And once you publicly frame an operation as running another country, you ignite two battles at once. The physical battle unfolding in streets, bases, and infrastructure, and the legitimacy battle raging across information space, diplomatic chambers, and public consciousness. And Venezuela's remaining leadership responded exactly as states historically do when sovereignty is threatened, by reaching immediately for the most powerful, unifying language available with acting leadership figures, especially Delcy Rodriguez, framing the operation as colonial aggression and declaring that Venezuela will never be a colony, while insisting Maduro remains the legitimate president, and that phrasing is not emotional improvisation, it is strategic mobilization language designed to fuse internal factions, warn military commanders against defection, and reframe the crisis away from approval of Maduro and toward resistance against foreign control. Because once a population is told this is no longer about politics, but about national survival, the calculus of resistance hardens, compromise collapses, and interventions grow darker, bloodier, and more protracted. And when you layer in the Cuba dimension, the story expands from a national crisis to a regional flashpoint almost instantly, because Trump's own comments and the subsequent chatter included claims that Cuban personnel were present protecting Maduro and that Cuban casualties occurred. And even where numbers remain uncertain and reporting remains cautious, the allegation alone is enough to inflame the region, because Cuba's political, intelligence, and economic ties to Venezuela are deep, especially through long-standing oil arrangements. And if Cuban personnel were harmed, Havana now faces domestic pressure to respond, not necessarily with conventional force, but through intensified diplomatic confrontation, intelligence escalation, cyber activity, and deeper alignment with U.S. rivals. And this is how single operations metastasize into regional confrontations without another missile ever being fired, through alliances, retaliation cycles, and proxy pressure that unfold quietly but relentlessly. And then comes the China factor, which adds a far more dangerous strategic dimension, because reports that Chinese officials were present in Venezuela for talks around the time of the operation, even if later revised or partially disputed, underscore the core reality that Venezuela is not an isolated theater, but a contested arena where major powers have assets, influence, and reputational stakes, meaning this action did not occur in a vacuum, but in a crowded geopolitical space where Russia, China, Iran, and regional actors are all watching closely and recalibrating accordingly. And this immediately raises the question viewers are already sensing, even if they cannot yet articulate it clearly. What does this signal about the rules of the international system? Because if the United States can cross borders, remove a leader, openly discuss administering another country and its resources, then it does not just change facts on the ground. It alters the permission structure of global behavior, not by granting formal approval, but by handing rivals a rhetorical weapon they can archive, cite, and deploy later. Because while China does not need permission to pressure Taiwan and Russia does not need permission to brutalize Ukraine, both gain propaganda leverage when they can point and say, you did it first. And in the modern era, propaganda is not cheap talk. It shapes alliances, sanctions enforcement, domestic consent, and the willingness of neutral states to look the other way. And this is where the story takes its most dangerous turn, because the U.S. appears to be telling two fundamentally different stories at the same time. One maximalist, emotional, and politically charged, talking about control, resources, and dominance, and the other minimalist, procedural, and legalistic, describing the action as a law enforcement style arrest mission, a narrow trigger-based operation not requiring broad authorization. And these narratives do not coexist comfortably because mismatched narratives are a flashing red warning sign that the plan is either unfinished, improvised, or deliberately obscured behind safer language, and that contradiction is precisely why backlash inside U.S. politics has been so fierce, with lawmakers arguing that you cannot treat a foreign intervention like serving a warrant in Miami, while the president describes it like a takeover. And that contradiction doesn't just create controversy, it sets the stage for a constitutional confrontation inside the United States with war powers debates, fund-in fights, recorded votes, and institutional stress, all unfolding while events on the ground continue regardless of Washington's readiness. And this is where the story evolves from foreign crisis to domestic reckoning. Because critics are not defending Maduro, they are defending process, arguing that the gravest decision a democracy makes, war, cannot be initiated unilaterally and justified afterward with shifting explanations. And this is why precision matters, because the legal controversy lives in the gap between arrest framing and governance rhetoric, and the war powers debate is not academic, it is the last institutional break available if Congress chooses to use it. And once lawmakers force votes and draft resolutions, political pressure stops being rhetorical and becomes recorded, forcing every member to choose a side. And when veteran lawmakers enter the conversation, the narrative sharpens further, because when figures who have seen war warn that this is the beginning of another forever war, that phrase functions as a memory trigger, instantly recalling Iraq and Afghanistan, the early certainty, the sweeping claims, the lack of timelines, the mission creep, the human cost, and the decades-long aftermath. And when oil enters the frame, the legitimacy problem intensifies exponentially, because oil is the symbol that collapses complex security arguments into a simple moral accusation, sending young people to fight so corporations can profit. And whether that is fair or not matters less initially than the speed at which the symbol spreads, which is why critics hammer it. Critics relentlessly, while supporters try to redirect toward drugs, cartels, and narco-terrorism. But the counter-argument lands hard. If arrest warrants exist worldwide, do you invade every country to enforce them? Because that question exposes the slippery slope at the heart of the law enforcement narrative. And this tension deepens further when Trump publicly undercuts Maria Corina Machado, a major opposition figure casting doubt on her support and legitimacy. Because regardless of the internal Venezuelan dynamics, the effect externally is immediate and destabilizing. signaling uncertainty about who the U.S. recognizes, potentially fracturing opposition unity, and creating the very power vacuum that history shows is the breeding ground for chaos, as military factions, intelligence services, rival politicians, armed groups, and external sponsors rush to fill the gap. And if the United States is serious about temporarily running Venezuela, it inherits the hardest task in politics: governance after collapse, not the press conference, but the morning after, controlling security, protecting infrastructure, preventing revenge violence, stabilizing cities, and doing all of it without appearing as an occupying force, because the moment occupation is perceived, resistance becomes easier to organize and every incident becomes recruitment. And this is why even some voices within Trump's own political base begin expressing doubt, because prolonged foreign entanglements have a way of turning politically toxic faster than anticipated. And the deeper analytical truth is that the United States is not just fighting external resistance, it is fighting time itself, because the longer involvement lasts, the more incidents occur, the more outrage grows, the harder exit becomes, and confusion accelerates that trap, because unclear missions destroy trust. And without trust, allies hesitate, Congress resists, and the public withdraws consent. And as the next phase unfolds, the outcome hinges on a narrow window, with possibilities ranging from a fast transition and exit to a prolonged standoff, to insurgency-style escalation, to regional blowback, to domestic constitutional rupture, all bound together by one systemic risk: the precedent effect, because once great powers demonstrate that borders and sovereignty are conditional on strength, smaller states learn a cynical lesson about international law, and the global system shifts subtly but permanently toward raw power logic. And for ordinary people, the stakes are tangible: higher costs, greater instability, diverted attention from domestic crises, energy price volatility, migration pressure, and political radicalization, because the operation itself is the easy headline, but the transition is the hard reality. And every time leaders say we will run it until it is safe, history demands the same questions. Safe for whom, by what standard, and who decides when the mission ends? Because when those answers remain unclear, mission creep is not a possibility, it is a probability. And this story, whether you support or oppose the action, is not over tonight. It is just entering the phase that defines years rather than days, because the most dangerous words in foreign policy are not "we're going in," they are "we'll be out soon." And as this story pushes forward into its next phase, the tension only intensifies, because now the world is no longer reacting to what happened, but bracing for what might come next. And this is the moment where uncertainty becomes its own force, shaping decisions before facts ever do, because governments, markets, and populations do not wait for perfect information. They move on perception. And the perception crystallizing right now is that a line may have been crossed without a clear map for how to step back. And once that belief takes hold, it alters behavior everywhere, from military planning rooms to currency markets to border checkpoints thousands of miles away, because allies begin quietly asking what support actually means if the mission itself keeps shifting. And adversaries begin probing for weakness, not through tanks, but through pressure points, cyber intrusions, disinformation campaigns, and economic leverage, all calibrated to test resolve without triggering open conflict. And this is where the true danger lies, not in dramatic headlines, but in cumulative stress, because every additional signal of ambiguity invites another challenge, another test, another attempt to see how far the United States is willing to go and at what cost. And inside Venezuela, the situation becomes even more combustible as ordinary citizens are pulled into a conflict they did not choose, navigating shortages, uncertainty, and fear while competing narratives flood their phones and streets. some promising liberation, others warning of occupation, all of them demanding loyalty. And history shows that when populations are forced to choose, under pressure, outcomes become unpredictable because fear does not produce clean allegiances. It produces survival instincts, black markets, informal power structures, and localized violence that no central authority fully controls. And this is why stabilization phases consume empires, because they require patience, restraint, cultural fluency, and legitimacy all at once. And legitimacy cannot be imposed at gunpoint, no matter how precise the operation that preceded it. And as the days unfold, the question dominating private conversations in Washington is no longer whether the initial action was successful, but whether success can be defined at all, because capturing a leader is a moment. Governing a fractured society is a process, and processes resist timelines, resist slogans, resist certainty. And while officials attempt to reassure the public with confident language, the internal machinery of government begins grinding under the weight of unanswered questions about costs, troop rotations, rules of engagement, exit strategies, and the legal scaffolding holding it all together. And the longer those questions linger, the louder the institutional friction becomes, because bureaucracies are not built for ambiguity at scale. They demand parameters, and when parameters are absent, paralysis or overreach fills the void. And meanwhile, global rivals are not waiting. They are studying every statement, every contradiction, every hesitation, cataloging them not for today's response, but for tomorrow's leverage. Because power in the modern era is not only about what you do, but about how predictably you do it. And unpredictability, while sometimes mistaken for strength, often erodes trust faster than weakness ever could. And this erosion compounds as international organizations struggle to respond, issuing cautious statements that reveal more about division than consensus, signaling to the world that collective frameworks are strained at the exact moment they are needed most. And when those frameworks wobble, smaller states feel exposed, prompting hedging behavior, arms purchases, new alignments, and preemptive moves designed to avoid becoming the next test case. And this is how instability spreads without formal declarations, through anticipation rather than action. And back home, the American public begins processing the story not as an abstract foreign affair, but as a potential drain on attention, resources, and unity. Because people intuitively understand that prolonged entanglements have opportunity costs, that every dollar an hour spent managing chaos abroad is one not spent addressing crises at home. And this awareness feeds polarization, with competing narratives hardening into identity markers rather than policy debates, making compromise politically toxic even as flexibility becomes strategically necessary. And the administration finds itself boxed in by its own rhetoric, because bold language rallies supporters in the short term but constrains maneuverability in the long term, turning adjustment into apparent retreat and pragmatism into perceived weakness. And this is the paradox at the heart of the moment, that strength requires adaptability, but adaptability requires narrative space, and narrative space has been narrowed by absolutist framing. And as the clock ticks forward, the stakes sharpen, not through a single dramatic escalation, but through accumulation, through the slow realization that this is no longer a crisis with an end point, but a situation with momentum. And momentum does not care about intentions, only direction. And unless that direction is clarified with discipline, consistency, and restraint, the forces now in motion will continue to expand outward, touching regions, institutions, and lives far removed from the original operation, because this is how history often unfolds. Not in clean arcs, but in cascading consequences, where decisions made in urgency echo for years. And tonight, as the world watches for the next statement, the next image, the next signal, the most consequential development may be the quiet one, the normalization of uncertainty, the acceptance that this is just how things are now, And once uncertainty becomes normal, instability stops being shocking and starts being expected. And that is the threshold every global system fears crossing, because beyond it, control becomes reactive, legitimacy becomes contested, and the future becomes something no one truly commands, only navigates moment by moment, consequence by consequence, with history watching closely and recording everything.